Okay.
Hello, Geshe.
Hi. Hello.
What time is it now? Yeah. Okay. May I start?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Leora can join us, so
Okay.
I'll start. Welcome everybody to the Dharma meeting of Dharma Friends of Israel. Thank you so much to Geshe Kelsang Wangmo for teaching us this beautiful text of entering into the middle way by Chandrakirti, and for kindness for doing this along the last 52 weeks.
Oh, 52 weeks now.
Okay, please, Geshe.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, so we start, of course, first with setting the right motivation to make the study of Chandrakirti's text most effective. So as usual, let's start with some breathing meditation just to calm the mind, settle the mind. And then in order to be inspired, motivated, in order to be inspired and to be motivated, visualize in the space in front of you the fully enlightened Buddha. Who calmly sits in the space in front of you appearing in the form of a fully ordained monk. Seated on the full lotus, open lotus, and a sun disk and a moon disk. And who's inseparable from your spiritual, from your personal Lama or your personal Lamas. And then surrounding the Buddha, the great masters who've followed his teachings and attained great realizations. Like Nagarjuna, Ayadeva, Bhagavivika, and all the other great Nalanda masters. All the lineage lamas of India and Tibet. Passing on the pure teachings in an unbroken lineage to this present day. Just visualize them in space in front of you. Even if they don't appear clearly, just feel their presence. And again, they're inseparable from your Vipassana Lama or Lamas. And then to remind us, while we're practicing the Dharma, what is our main goal? Think that you're surrounded by all sentient beings. Appearing in different forms. Experiencing anger, attachment, and other afflictions, all arising from their basic misapprehension of reality. Experiencing endless problems, pain and suffering. And remembering that basically they're all the same in that, like ourselves, they just want to live a happy, peaceful life and avoid pain and other unwanted experiences. And that understanding gives rise to affectionate love, or the sense of closeness, acceptance, and affection towards each and every one of those living beings surrounding us. Giving rise to great compassion. Just the aspiration which wishes out of great affection that all these beings be free from suffering and its causes. May I be able personally to protect them from the different types of sufferings. And of course, that which causes these sufferings. Great compassion then becomes the special attitude. That is the determination to do whatever it takes, however long we'll need, however much time we need. We will do whatever we can to free sentient beings from what is extra in their mind and from that which prevents them to be liberated. And that determination then becomes bodhicitta. The determination to attain the enlightened state of a Buddha. For the welfare of all mother sentient beings. Try to really generate that determination from the depth of your heart. Feel it from deep within. From now on, until I reach the enlightened state of a Buddha, I will not let go of that mind. And it's with this mind as my motivation that I will today study Chandakirti's text. Reflect on its meaning and meditate on it. And then while holding onto bodhicitta, let's recite the prayers together. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. And then focusing on all sentient beings surrounding us. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings never be separated from happiness that is free from suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. Then direct it at the Buddha, the great masters who are inseparable from Vipassana Lama. Reverently I prostrate with my body, speech, and mind. I present every type of offering, actual and imagined. I declare all my negative actions accumulated since beginning this time. And rejoice in the merit of all holy and ordinary beings. Please remain until the end of cyclic existence. And turn the wheel of Dharma for living beings. I dedicate my own merits and those of others to the great enlightenment. Okay. All right. Well, for this week, once again, we'll continue our practice of bodhicitta, that is preparing for generating the mind of enlightenment. Well, hopefully you've been doing this for the last, 52 weeks or even longer than that since we started with the Heart Sutra. But nonetheless, it needs to be deepened, and that is part of what we're doing right now. So we started off about 3 weeks ago. I asked you to just become aware of the kindness of other sentient beings, just the fact that they exist and how directly or indirectly they improve our life, they benefit us. Due to them, due to their existence, due to their effort and so forth, we have food, we have drink, we have streets and buildings and so forth. So the basic necessities of life, and even from the point of view of the Dharma, if it wasn't for annoying people who allow us to practice patience, if it wasn't for people in need who allow us to practice generosity, if it wasn't for unenlightened beings, well, who enable us or who help us to generate the mind of enlightenment, we wouldn't spiritually be able to evolve. Therefore, just a sense of this incredible kindness of all sentient beings, but more with the purpose of that being to generate more of a equanimity, which means equanimity not in the sense of indifference. I don't care. The ones that I was very attached to, or the ones I was previously I hated or I had aversion towards, now I don't care about them, but rather a closeness or an openness towards all sentient beings, no matter who they are, no matter what they've done. So just a sense of openness to whatever is to come. So even without that great sense of love, compassion, but nonetheless an openness towards that. So really a type of now, well, as a preparation for equanimity, in the sense that, well, understanding our differences are so superficial. Differences, especially from a negative point of view, if there's hatred, dislike, and so forth, aversion. And then from a positive point of view, those we're really attached to, well, we'll have to let them go at the latest when we die, and then we won't remember we had the relationship that we have now. So to really become aware of that, reflect on that over and over again. But something I would like you to do this coming week in particular, your main focus should be Well, if you think all sentient beings, what does that actually mean to you? All sentient beings, to generate a sense of equanimity and openness towards all sentient beings, open to develop love and compassion towards them. But all sentient beings, well, sometimes it's just like an abstract. Or if you check your own mind, there may be a sense of all humans. And there's a difficulty. Well, sometimes it's just all animals. If you really like animals, it may just include all animals and less so humans. But then talking of other states of existence, well, that makes it even harder. So actually, there are these three groups of beings, if you like. There are humans, there are animals, and there are all these other living beings that we've heard they exist, but possibly don't believe in their existence, or at least, well, we doubt their existence. We've never perceived anyone on a different realm, and therefore we're having a hard time to focus on them in that. At least we have a sense of gratitude towards them. Well, got nothing to do with me. I don't even know they exist. And of course, taking it from there, generating a sense of closeness and openness, closeness, and eventually love, compassion, and so forth. So all these three groups all pose a challenge in that sense of equanimity and love and so forth. Don't arise easily for different reasons. With human beings, I believe the main difficulty is, well, we have complicated relationships with certain human beings. When we know them, of course, it seems, well, a particular person may be a neighbor. We have a hard time wanting to benefit that person since, well, they may harm so many other people around us, or even a person we don't know. Therefore, to pay special attention, who are the people we have a bit of a hard time with? Maybe a politician who's really selfish and just works for his own benefit. To focus more directly on that particular person. Okay, so if you just check your own mind, as Yang Rinpoche said so beautifully today, maybe you were there when he said it, use the Dharma as a mirror to reflect your own mind. So use this to check, okay, so all human beings, which human being or beings do I have a hard time with? And to be with that for some time, become aware of it. And of course, remember, no matter who they are, they have Buddha nature, and eventually, maybe before ourselves, or even before our teachers, they will attain enlightenment. Who knows? So that's with regard to humans. But also with animals, there's a different difficulty. We usually, well, if we like animals, if we love animals, it's easier to wish them all the best. I mean, we see how without them having much control, they're being used, they're being killed, and so forth. So in some cases, it's easier to generate compassion. But a sense that even a mosquito can become enlightened is much harder. And oftentimes when people come to the Dharma and they hear all sentient beings attain enlightenment, again and again, there's this kind of like, even the mosquito, this kind of, it shows the doubt in their mind that like a little fly can attain enlightenment. It seems almost ridiculous. So we have a hard time thinking that animals may become, well, humans and just like a Buddha. And again, to focus on that if we have that difficulty, and also include all sentient beings, however tiny they are, little worms, bedbugs, bees, and mosquitoes, and so forth. To make a point to include them too. They have a mind, a clear mind. It's not in the nature of their afflictions, or the afflictions are not in the nature of their mind, and therefore they have the nature of a Buddha. They have all that it's needed to attain the mind of a Buddha, or attain the enlightened state of a Buddha. And of course, then all those are different realms. I mean, to allow at least the possibility. I guess in the way, the 21st century, we know there are lots of things we can't perceive with our sense organs. There are, well, different waves and different particles and so forth that maybe a few hundred years ago, no one believed in their existence, and now we know they do exist. We believe in them, although, well, we've never seen them. We've never had a direct experience of them ourselves. So therefore, well, maybe science at some point, and surely it will evolve further and further. Maybe in 400 or 500 years, science will be able to establish the existence of not just life on other planets, but actually the existence of other living beings around us that without sense consciousnesses, we just can't perceive them. So we are surrounded, from the point of view of the, well, according to the explanations in the scriptures, we're surrounded by other living beings. We share the same living space, but because of our different karma, we can't perceive each other. Or maybe sometimes it's one-sided, they perceive us, but not vice versa, and so forth. And they're just like us, just like animals, other humans. They want to be happy, they don't want to suffer, and they have the same potential as we do. And they outnumber us big time, as it is said. So this is even harder to believe. There's so many insects in this world, but beings in the lower realms, the predator or the hellish kind of realms, well, they outnumber all the insects in this world by far. So to think about along these lines, to really allow this possibility, open our mind to other forms of life, and of course then include them into our own equanimity, into our sense of equilibrium, as in like, well, whoever they are, may they be happy. They deserve to be happy, and they have the potential to attain that, well, that lasting happiness. And so to be open to this, to generate, that openness and equanimity. All right, so for this week, I want you to focus really on these different forms of life. See which ones you have a hard time with, maybe all three of them, depending on how much time you have. You know from your own mind what you struggle with the most, and then you take that. If there's something you struggle with the most, well, that's a good indication that it's something you should consider further. So I hope it was not too complicated, but yeah, that's what I want you to do for this coming week. Focus on that in particular. All right. Now, returning to the text, I still have Jimmy's one question, but I haven't really had time to read through it more thoroughly. So please give me another week before I'll answer that. And of course, in the meantime, more questions are welcome. But this question, as you'll see next week, it's a little difficult. I have to do a little bit more reading on this. It's about a different type of meditation that I'm not familiar with, a non-Buddhist meditation, I believe, or at least not a meditation that is part of the Tibetan tradition. So I want to understand better what is meant with this meditation, and therefore by this, what do you mean with this question? All right. So then we can dive right away into the subject matter, into the topic, which again, the topic still being selflessness. There will be selflessness for a while, for some time to come. Now we got to verse 121, I believe. How far did we get? 122? Did we already cover 122? I seem to remember 121. We didn't do much last time.
The middle of 121.
Okay, great. Now, we started, of course, with the first verse that, well, since it's such an important verse again and again cited, I might as well just quickly say it again. So the wisdom, understanding with the wisdom that all our afflictions and all faults, so faults here means the different types of sufferings. In particular, in the commentaries, it talks about the suffering of birth, aging, sickness, and death, which is representative of all the other types of faults or problems. Well, all those and their causes, the afflictions, they originate or derive from the identity view, a view at a self, grasping at the perishable collection. So grasping, what is the perishable collection? Well, it refers to the aggregates, mind and body, and even to the conventionally existent self. So they are perishable, they're impermanent, they're a collection, they're made of parts. And the identity view grasps at those existent, well, aggregates and self, and perceives them as inherently existent. So it grasps at them in an unrealistic way. And knowing that self, this perceiving that self, that inherent existence of the I, of other phenomena, but well, here actually of the I, of oneself, this inherently existent self, on the basis of the aggregates and on the basis of the conventional I. So the yogis, knowing that the self is the focus of this identity view, the yoga engages in the negation of selfhood. Okay, so in other words, well, all our trouble comes from self-grasping, in particular with regard to the I, and we need to get rid of that. Okay, and I asked you this question last time. Why is it more the attachment to the I versus the attachment to, well, the aggregates? And maybe you've given it some thought. Maybe we've got some time. Maybe if you can remind me, Iki, I can ask you and see what you've got to say, whether that's actually the case. There's more attachment to the I and less to the aggregates. And anyway, if it's more attachment to the I, what is your view on that? Maybe we'll make a little bit of time just to hear what you think. So please remind me. I'll also try and remember. But anyway, in the meantime, so the first verse basically eases us into the subject matter. Well, cause for all our problems, of all our difficulties, is holding on to a self that's unrealistic. In particular, our own self, our own I, based on the perishable collection of a conventional, merely labeled I, but also on the basis of mind and body, the aggregates. Okay, so that's what we need to deal with. In the end, it comes down to that. Also, well, Yamden Rinpoche gave this really beautiful quote. Might as well also give it here because it's from the Pramana Vatika, and I translated it for Yamden Rinpoche's teachings. So just mentioning again how everything arises from the self, how our wrong view of the self gives rise to all our other trouble. It's verse 217, 218, and then 19. So it goes, the ones who see the self, so the ones who apprehend an unrealistic self, they say I. Based on that misapprehension, they say I. Not just labeled, but really saying I. And are always attached to it. Okay, so always attached to it in the sense, well, the moment you have an unrealistic apprehension of what the self, what the I is, you're going to be attached to it. So that attachment is self-centeredness or self-grasping, self-cherishing. That attachment gives rise to craving for pleasure. Well, it gives rise to attachment to that which is mine, and then of mine, my pleasure. And the belief or the conviction that whatever is mine gives me happiness. So craving also for that which is mine, for that which gives me happiness, gives me security, and so forth. Craving obstructs all the faults. So if I crave the self or I crave pleasure, well, it obstructs all the faults of that which gives me the pleasure. And from seeing just positive qualities, there's complete craving. So in other words, when there's attachment already, then attachment to the self, attachment to that which is mine, and attachment to that which gives me pleasure out of this attachment for pleasure itself, we just see the positive. We don't see the faults of that. We don't see the limitations of the kind of limited happiness we experience. We don't see the faults with the objects we seek happiness from, like other people, other objects, wealth, and so forth. We don't see the faults of even ourselves. So we're in denial about that, but rather try to see positive qualities, unless, of course, we feel down on ourselves, we're depressed and feel low about ourselves, but that's different. But in general, It's like the sense we're more precious, more important, mine is more important, and so forth. So saying mine, they seek accomplishment, right? So they seek accomplishment, wanting to accomplish something for themselves. Therefore, as long as they have attachment to the self, they will circle in samsara. They will remain in samsara. So telling us here, okay, so it's from that self-grasping, then there's self-centeredness, there's attachment to I'm, mine, to pleasure, which is part of what's mine, my pleasure. And of course, there's aversion if we don't get that, there's jealousy and so forth, all the way to accumulating extreme actions, karmic actions, leading to the different types of suffering. So we want to get rid of suffering. That's the way to go about it. Now, dealing with suffering at its root. Okay, but then the next verse starts already to introduce us to the reasoning that I mentioned briefly last time. In general, there are 5 main reasonings in the Prasangika, in the Madhyamika school, Madhyamika system, not just Prasangika, but all the Madhyamika philosophical schools. And those 5 reasonings, we're interested in the first of those. And then there are 3 further reasonings. What are those 3 further ones? They deal with the fact that phenomena don't arise inherently, which we basically dealt with in the first part of the 6th chapter, more specifically of the 3 types of reasoning. And I'm not going to mention all of them right now. I did already in the past. I did as part of Yangden, which is teaching, so I don't need to mention all of them. But one of them we've already gone through explicitly. It's the diamond splitter reasoning. Nothing arises from something that is the same itself, inherently different, both or causelessly or without a cause. That diamond splitter reasoning, that's the one of those 3 of the 5 reasonings. There are 3 dealing with the fact that phenomena don't arise inherently. So more with regard to how phenomena arise, they don't arise inherently, and that is being negated by Chandrakirti with respect to not mainly the self, but with respect to phenomena other than the self. So you've seen previously, we use the seed, the seedling, the sprout, and so forth. That was part of the first. And so now we've come to the part of this text which deals with the I. And here the reasoning is none of the 3 that I just mentioned, with the diamond splitter being explicitly mentioned before, the other 2 implicitly. No, it's the first of the 5 reasonings, which is the reasoning with regard to being one or different from its parts. That's the type of reasoning. So the 5th reasoning is the reasoning of dependent arising. I've mentioned that before. But yeah, so it's the first reasoning, which simply said, it's saying, well, the I doesn't exist inherently because it's neither one with its aggregates nor different. Okay, neither one with its aggregates nor totally different, as in like inherently different, kind of separate, different from it. Okay, now that is the reasoning here. In the sense, it's telling us the following. So as you probably know, a reasoning, sometimes it's called a sign. A sign. So we're trying to infer, right now it's not obvious to us that the I doesn't exist inherently, since it appears to exist inherently, and we're used to holding on to it existing inherently. And the fact that it doesn't exist that way, right now it's hidden to us. It's not obvious. But there are other facts about this I that are either obvious to us or more obvious, less hidden than the lack of inherent existence of this I. And if they're not yet obvious, we need to deal with it. So the fact that the I is neither one with its parts nor totally different from it. And the next verses, they deal with exactly that, trying to help us to become more familiar with the idea, well, the self is not totally separate from the aggregates, nor is it the same as the aggregates. So there's no other possibility, which is why, well, it can't exist the way it appears. Now, one thing I'm going to say now, and I'll say it again later, because it may not be that easily understood right away. Because we're only allowed two possibilities as part of this reasoning. So saying the I doesn't exist inherently, the I doesn't exist inherently, that's what I'm trying to establish. And now my reason, the reason that proves that is because the I is not inherently, it's not one with its parts, and it's not totally separate from its parts or from its aggregates. Well, is there another possibility? Is there another possibility? Actually, there is. Actually, there is. Because from a Buddhist point of view, from a Prasangika school point of view, the I is not one with its aggregates, but it's also not totally separate from its aggregates, but it still exists and exists in relation to its aggregates. So since it's none of the two, and it does exist in relation to its aggregates, there must be a third possibility. Does that make sense? Right? There must be a third possibility. Okay, what is that third possibility? Well, it's none of those first two. It is neither one, that it's not identical with its mind and body, or it is not mind and body. The self is not mind and body, and it's not totally separate from it. So how does it exist then? Well, it's not the same as mind and body, but it exists as being of one nature, as in like one can't exist without the other. Well, why is that not included in that reasoning, right? Why? How can you say, well, because it's neither, how can you prove, if you leave that out, that the I doesn't exist inherently? How come you don't say, well, the I doesn't exist inherently because it's neither one nor totally separate nor one nature with the aggregates? Well, of course I can't use that as a reason because that's not true, that it's not of one nature with mind and body. So I can't use that as a reason. But then why do I only use those two possibilities? Well, the reason is simply that the I doesn't exist inherently. That's what I tried to prove. And if that I, well, trying to prove that the I doesn't exist inherently, but that I, which I perceive, but that I wrongly perceive, is such an inherent I. It is an inherent I. I'm not perceiving a conventional I. I'm not aware when I think of I that the I is really just the conventional I. To me, the moment I start thinking about the I, there's a sense it exists inherently. So, therefore, if that inherent I really existed, it could only be either identical with mind and body, or it would be totally separate from them. Well, why could it not be of one nature with them? Simply because then it would have to depend on something. If it was of one nature with the aggregates, then it would depend on something other than itself. But that is by definition the opposite of inherent existence. If something depends on something other than itself, then it no longer exists independently or inherently. But if I assume an inherently existent I, and that's all we're trying to refute here, then if that existed, either it would be just one with the aggregates, because of course, obviously, it could only be found in somewhere to do with the aggregates, but then it would have to be the aggregates, because if it was something different, not inherently different, but of the same nature, but still different, then it would have to depend on these aggregates, and that's impossible if it exists inherently. So either it would have to be one or totally separate. That's why you have only these two possibilities. No further possibility is given. For the conventional I, it exists only in relation to the five aggregates. It's merely labeled on the basis of those. So it's okay. It's neither one with the aggregates nor totally separate. There's a third option, but that option is only open to a conventional I. All right. Having said that much, now we're trying to, before this reasoning becomes effective, before we come to understand that based on the fact that an inherent I, the way it appears to us, is neither inherent, is neither one with the aggregates, nor totally separate from it. Once we really understand that, then it's an effective reasoning to establish, therefore the I can't exist inherently. But we need to get there fast to really understand that this is true for the I. Understand it's neither one with its aggregate nor totally separate. We have to understand that. So what do we need to do? We need to negate two things with regard to the I and its aggregates. We need to negate, we need to refute that the I is one with the aggregates, and we need to refute that it's totally separate from the aggregates. So it's an object of negation with regard to those two aspects we have to identify, right? It's just like with the object of negation of emptiness. That's what we eventually try to refute. That comes later. But we first need to understand the reason that then later on we use to infer that the I doesn't exist inherently. We need to understand the reason. Refute correctly that the I doesn't exist as one with its aggregates, nor as totally separate from the aggregates. So we need to negate those two aspects first. And we need an object of negation for that to identify it correctly. So who helps us to identify it correctly? The wrong view of some of the non-Buddhist schools and the wrong view of some of the Buddhist schools. Okay, so starting with some of the non-Buddhist schools, the ones that are known. So here Chandrakirti gives a really extensive explanation of their views. I mean, well, implied in what he says in verse 121. Sorry, I'm going over it once again, but I find this is important. So the self is the consumer, a permanent entity, and a non-creator. It is talking about the Samkhya view. Now, actually at this point, if you look at the self-commentary by Chandrakirti, or if you look at illuminating the intent, it gives an explanation of the Samkhya view on the self. So I was tempted first to just, go through this and basically just explain what is in here. But it wouldn't be an explanation, it would just be a repetition of what is in here, because I certainly don't understand the Samkhya view. The Samkhya view, of course, was explained in the scriptures in Tibet, but was it deeply understood? Well, probably not. Be difficult to think because there were no Samkhyas in Tibet. And it was an understanding that was passed on from those who did study with the Samkhyas, so those great Nalanda masters. But when Buddhism came to Tibet after Shantarakshita, there was no interaction with them. And those basic views were, of course, passed on, but a deep understanding. So sometimes we would start to debate it, but in the end, we would always have to say, I don't know what the Samkhya person thinks, because there's not much material available versus the material available on Buddhism. So with the non-Buddhist schools, we don't really know. And I don't need to give this explanation that's given the illumination of the thought. I mean, whatever is there, you can read that. I have nothing further to say than that. I could have maybe read a few more commentaries on that. But anyway, the point is not to understand the Samkhya. So the point is really the view that they set forth here, it comes down to accepting a type of self that is permanent. In its nature, they say it's permanent. In the end, it's unchanging, although it may slightly change. They may have that view, or sometimes it kind of changes, but deep within it's unchanging. They may have that kind of view. Or some non-Buddhist schools have the view it doesn't change at all. So there's a sense that there's a permanent, lasting kind of I that's unchanging, basically unchanging, that exists totally separate from the aggregates and can't have any parts. Therefore, what parts would that be? Any part of an I that we describe as part of the aggregates. And since it's totally separate from the aggregates, it can be only partless. What parts would it have? It doesn't have arms and legs and so forth because it exists totally separate from the aggregates. So if the body has parts, it wouldn't mean the eye has parts. If it existed that way, these non-Buddhist systems set it forth. If it existed that way, if it had arms and legs and so forth, well, it would be connected to the aggregates. But we've just heard they believe this eye to be totally separate. So that explanation, that eye, so without, understanding their view definitely helps to a certain degree to understand that they perceive or apprehend a permanent, partless, independent self. But I guess getting a general sense of that is still helpful. And then the text goes on to say, so here it goes on to say the self is the consumer. So the way the Samkhyas look at it, it's that which consumes, it's that which utilizes something. It is permanent, it's a permanent entity and a non-creator. It doesn't create anything because the Samkhyas believe in some primal substance that creates anything, and therefore the person itself doesn't create anything. And there are also some other aspects like the elements and so forth. They create also things, but no, the self doesn't create anything. It's devoid of qualities and inactive, because that which has qualities and that which is active is this primal substance. And this is what the Tirthikas postulate. Okay, that's what it says in 121. That's the Samkhyas. And then with the next lines, and then on the next two lines, on the basis of slight and minor variations, there are other Tirthikas, there are other non-Buddhist systems, such as the Vaisheshikas. So with these two lines as part of verse 121, Chandrakirti talks of the Vaisheshikas that have a slightly different version of a self, maybe more refined than the previous ones, but still, in essence, what they believe in, the self that they apprehend, is a self that exists totally separate from mind and body. Okay. Now that helps us to identify that which is the object of negation here when we say the self does not exist as one with the aggregates and is totally separate from the aggregates. Because what the non-Buddhist schools here assert is an I that exists as totally separate from the aggregates. That's their assertion. So that's the kind of I that if the I existed inherently, it would have to be one with the aggregates or totally separate from the aggregates. And we're trying to deny both possibilities in order then to infer that there's no inherent I. All right. So they exist, they think of, those non-Buddhist systems believe in an inherently separate I, because if it's independently existent from mind and body, it's an inherently different self. And first, that needs to be presented, understood, so I know what to refute. And that's what you do here. At first, well, identify those two systems. And then it's right away refuted. It says, like a barren woman's child, or like the horns of a rabbit, or like flying cows, or anything that is non-existent. Well, in the same way, it is devoid of arising. Such a self, such an permanent, partless, independent self doesn't exist. So such a self simply does not exist, as it says. It also cannot be the basis for grasping at an I. It cannot be claimed to exist even on the conventional level. So here it tells us two things. It's not the basis for grasping at an I, nor can it be claimed to exist even on the conventional level. All right, what does that mean? It cannot be the basis for grasping at an I. This needs to be explained. This is an important philosophical concept now that I explain you, that when you study philosophy, you're familiar with this. When we say wrong view, when we say a wrong consciousness, we're talking about a mind, for instance, that wrongly perceives horns of a rabbit, that wrongly perceives a snow mountain to be blue, or a blue snow mountain, or that wrongly perceives an inherently existent I. Okay, so we're all familiar, yes, up to this point, with a mind that perceives something, the object of which doesn't exist. Okay, but how does that perception take place? Is it just perceiving just horns of a rabbit? Suddenly you just see horns of a rabbit? Or is there something that does exist based on which you wrongly perceive horns of a rabbit? Well, from a Buddhist point of view, it is the latter case. It's not just that you have no basis based on which you perceive, in this case, horns of a rabbit. No, the example horns of a rabbit is such that you see actually what's the basis for your perception are the ears of a rabbit. So the ears of a rabbit are wrongly perceived to be the horns of a rabbit. Therefore, there's always a basis. There is a basis, and sometimes it's also called a focal object. So focusing, the mind really focusing on rabbit ears, it's then not able to perceive them as rabbit ears, but based on those rabbit ears, the focal object perceives rabbit horns. So there's, with a wrong consciousness, there's always a focal object which is then misperceived. Blue snow mountains, what's the focal object? A white snow mountain. A white snow mountain, in actuality, a snow mountain is white, but due to the light and so forth, right, snow is white. But due to maybe a fold in the eye, for instance, or whatever other reason you're wearing some shades, well, some glasses, some shades. So therefore, you wrongly perceive your focal object is a white snow mountain perceived to be blue. Just in worldly, kind of a worldly example. This is just an ordinary example. Or take the coiled rope that is perceived as a snake, right? It's like, it's not just snake suddenly flying in the air. No, based on a speckled coiled rope, that's the focal object, you misperceive due to the light, right? The conditions, the example is usually given of a room, maybe a garage, and then this, in the corner of the garage, there's a coiled rope that's speckled, and you wrongly perceive that to be a snake. Focal object, an existent rope. Apprehended object, that which you apprehend, is the snake. White snow mountain, focal object, wrongly apprehended to be a blue snow mountain. The apprehended object is the blue snow mountain. Horns of a rabbit, focal object is the ears of the rabbit. Apprehended object are the horns of the rabbit. And the same is true for the eye. Focal object is the conventional eye, the merely labeled eye, which is then perceived to exist inherently. Okay, so the focal object is the existent eye. If you take the eye, and here the focus is on the perishable collection, transient or perishable collection, the mind, the view of the perishable collection, which is of course self-grasping at the inherent existence of my own I, of my own self. That's the focus here. But taking other wrong views when it comes to emptiness, or when it comes to inherent existence for that matter, perceiving an actual tree to exist inherently, perceiving an actual conventional body to exist inherently. So you always have a focal object, and in the case of inherent existence, is the conventional phenomenon that we now, or our mind now, perceives to exist inherently. That's the basis of a wrong view. Now, if we go back to the text, what was it? Verse 120. No, 124. 124, line 3. It's also unacceptable to be the basis for being's I clinging. What is it? What is it? It is the I that is accepted by the non-Buddhist schools, the permanent, partless, independent self. Is that the basis based on which we now perceive inherent existence? No, because that permanent, partless, independent self is not the existent self based on which we label, or on which we wrongly perceive, label inherent existence. That's not the I. The I is so the permanent partner's independent self is a non-existent I. The focal object, the basis for our self-grasping is the existent I. That's important. Okay? I hope that's clear. So the basis is the existent I. That's one part of this verse. And then for the I clinging, for the identity views present, even those. How to get there? There's no self separate from the aggregates exist, for there are no apprehension. No, there with the self remained. Huh? Oh no, sorry, there it is. 122. No wonder I get confused. Yeah, because it's got a similar sentence in there. So it also cannot be the basis for grasping at an I. So 122, I'm pointing at it, but you don't see what is on my screen. But anyway, it also cannot be the basis for grasping at an I. That is the permanent partner's independent self as it is accepted by the non-Buddhist. That is not an existent I. That is not the I that is here wrongly perceived. Likewise, it cannot be claimed to exist even on the conventional level. So it doesn't exist at all. So it can't be the basis for grasping at inherent existence, because that would be something that exists on a conventional level. So neither does it exist ultimately, nor does it exist just conventionally. I mean, in everyday life, there is no convention of a permanent partner's self. How could there be? It doesn't make sense to have such an I. Why not? Well, first of all, permanent. How could the I be permanent? How could the self be permanent? To be honest, it feels that way. I think I've mentioned it probably last time. I mentioned it before. It feels as if the I was permanent. The sense, oh, I never change. Okay. Or the sense that yesterday's I is still the same. Or when there's a feeling, I'm just the same. I'm never changing. I'm the same I that I was yesterday. That is the same. I'm just the same person. I'm still hurting. I'm still that I that was hurt yesterday. As if yesterday's I and today I were inseparable. No, I've moved on. The self, the I has changed. So what kind of unchanging I would that be? That's impossible. It feels that way. It appears that way for us, for our minds. Sometimes changing, sometimes it's not. So we've got that contradictory view. But at times it feels like it's permanent. No, that's impossible. Conventionally, what kind of I would that be? How can you say I've aged? I've become older. If you're permanent, a permanent I, how can it grow older? And moreover, how can it exist independently of mind and body? Again, how could you be meditating if your mind is meditating, if the I exists totally separate? You can't say anything about the I, because whatever's true for mind and body wouldn't be true for the mind, because they exist as totally separate. I meditate because my mind meditates, doesn't work. I walk because my legs walk, doesn't work. They're totally disconnected. I mean, even say my legs wouldn't be correct. Why would it be my legs if the I is totally separate? That'd be like saying my legs about the legs of my neighbor. My legs, totally separate, totally independent. The legs of my neighbor, there's a lady next door, so her legs are totally independent of my legs. So I wouldn't call them my legs. They've got nothing to do with me. Which is the same would be true here if such an I existed inherently. That's impossible. Okay. Now that's the non-Buddhist kind of I. And refuting that type of I, it's a coarse type of refuting a self. So there are coarser levels of an I, and this is a coarser level of a non-existent I. Okay. And here in this case, it's part of refuting the I to exist as totally separate from mind and body. That's what we're doing with this kind of independent self. All right, it's part of that. Okay. That's 122. Since all the various attributes, now this is more specifically with regard to the non-Buddhist systems as they set forth such a self, and really how fortunate that at the time when the Buddha came, they had these non-Buddhist systems who were very much preoccupied with what is the I, what is the self. And they were and if you read the Samkhya view, it's quite interesting. they definitely associate all our problems, all our difficulties with the I. There's a misapprehension of the I, but in a different way. I mean, like understanding that the primordial substance and the I are actually separate. And if the mind understands that, then the primordial substance withdraws from the I, and then that's liberation. So there is this sense of understanding how the I really exists, except the way they set forth that existence of the I has got nothing to do with the Buddhist view, but there's similarities. First of all, identifying an I, liberation, being concerned with the I, somehow, of course, selfishness, and so forth, attachment being an obstacle to liberation, and then in the end, the removal of something, the withdrawal of the primal substance or wherever it is, leading to a state of liberation. So there are great similarities. And the Buddha then setting forth Buddhism the way he did, it was helpful for a lot of those spiritual beings in India around the time, because were familiar with some of these ideas. They needed some refinement in terms of what really the I is and how it's refuted, to make it effective enough, or make that understanding will help that person based on that understanding to attain liberation. But it was not like totally strange ideas. Like in the West, those ideas are so strange. I mean, if you talk about nirvana, people roll their eyes. Oh, some kind of weird hippie India time. It's just for us, unless we have some imprints or we slowly get into it, this is totally strange for our ears when we hear about Buddhism. Whereas what the Buddha taught 2,500 years in India, people kind of knew it. It was like sounded familiar. The vocabulary was similar, and they didn't have such a hard time to accept it and then to understand it. And they took it much more seriously than possibly, well, we would do as Westerners, especially in the beginning. Anyway, the point is here. The point is here with regard to, and if we could have the verse again. Sorry, Iki, you need to switch back and forth. So 123, all the various attitudes of such a self as proposed in one treatise after another by the Tirthikas are undone by this logical proof that it is unarisen, which they accept that it's unarisen. That is, it doesn't make sense, because we need to have at least an impermanent I. So all the various attributes of such a self as set forth by the Samkhyas, by Sheshikas, and all the other Jains and all the other non-Buddhist philosophical schools, the six main ones and all the other ones that developed in India. Well, the problem is that in essence, they talk about a permanent self. In one treatise after the another, they set forth the self, and that is undone. The existence of such is undone is impossible, but by the logical proof that it is unarisen. Those are all permanent, and you can't have a permanent I. It has to be impermanent. Permanent I, which they accept. Unarisen means not created, not generated by causes and conditions, and therefore not impermanent. So none of the attributes that they ascribe to the self remains tenable, remains feasible. It doesn't make sense. All right. So that's more specifically. So those three verses, they deal specifically with the non-Buddhist school. I think I said 2 verses, but actually it's 3 verses, deal specifically with the view of the non-Buddhist schools. And then more generally, leaving aside those Buddhist schools, if just independent of that, we have a sense the I exists separate from the aggregates, it doesn't make sense, right? So having given that explanation, well, in general, even if you don't hold any of those non-Buddhist Indian views, if you just, well, happen to be from a totally different country as an example, and if you think about it, there is no separate self. There's no separate I from the aggregates. It's impossible. For there's no apprehension of self apart from the aggregates. How can there be a self apart from the aggregates, something separate? Every time you talk about the self, you're talking about mind or body. Have you ever talked about the self when not referring to mind and body? Like, I feel tired because the body felt tired. I feel happy because the mind is happy. I'm sick because the body is sick. I'm in grade 12 because mind is studying in grade 12, right? So everything you're saying about the I is indirectly said about one of the aggregates. You're really referring to something of the aggregates. The same is true that someone had this question today as part of Young Rinpoche's teachings. So someone's saying, when you touch a table, what do you touch? Right? If you touch a part of the table, what do you touch actually? Well, you touch the table. So saying you touch the table, you're really talking about a part of the table that was being touched. You can never touch the entire table. You touch a part and therefore a part of the table. And so you say you touch the table. You can't talk of the table as separate from its parts. You can't talk of the I as separate from mind and body. Try to explain such an I. What I would that be? Impossible. And moreover, you can't separate. If the I existed separate from mind and body, you would actually be able to totally separate mind and body and perceive the I. If you ignore mind and body, the I would become clearer, would appear much clearer. If you're kind of seeing them all together, mixed together, oh, then it's like, is it mind, is it body, is it I? No, but if the I existed separately, you could actually separate out mind and body, and the I should be crystal clear. How would that work? Be possible. It would be like you could take a table, leave aside all its parts, bits and pieces, just throw them aside and be left with the table. There was something intrinsic within the table. You should be able to find that. Okay. All right. So there's quite a bit of reasoning that deals exactly with that, saying, well, it is impossible. It's impossible to have such an I. So those who've spent there's no self separate from the aggregates exists, for there's no apprehension of self apart from the aggregates. So no self apart from its parts. Aggregates just another way of saying its parts, mind and body. And that's true for any other phenomenon. But of course, we're focusing mainly on the I. The same reasoning applies to anything else, but the focus is the I. It's also unacceptable to be the basis for being's I clinging. Not specifically the permanent partner's independent self as set forth by the Tirthikas. That's also not a basis, but just a separate I, just a separate kind of inherent separate entity can't serve as that kind of basis. Some would say an inherent I is also not the basis of that I clinging. But the point is, the basis for I clinging cannot be the inherent I. It cannot be a separate I. It cannot be the I permanent, partless, independent, as set forth by the non-Buddhist schools that don't just say it's totally separate from mind and body. It's on top of that permanent and partless. So that's a bit extra. But just an inherent separate I, a substantial I, it's never the basis of clinging to an I, because the basis, as we've had, has to be an existent I. And in particular, so this refers here in particular to the separate I, has to refer to the separate I here, not the inherent I. I mean, that's also true from the inherent I. The inherent I can't be such a basis, but as part of verse 124, it's also unacceptable to be the basis for beings, for sentient beings clinging to an I, because the identity view is present even in those unaware of such a self. What does that mean? Here, if this separate, the I that's totally separate, actually an I that is conceived to be totally separate from mind and body, that is not an innate view. We're not born with an innate sense. We're born with an innate sense, I exists inherently, definitely. But we're not born with an innate sense, the I is totally separate from the aggregates. We're not born with that wrong view. But this wrong view may still develop. Based on our innate sense, there's an inherent I. There may be an intellectually acquired, as it's called, view that the I exists as a totally separate entity from the aggregates. That is possible. The philosophers in India, they had developed it. And even separate from these philosophical systems, yeah, I guess even within Christianity, the view of a soul, that reminds me very much of an I that's totally separate from mind and body. And besides these systems, religious systems, philosophical systems, Freud's idea of a ego and a superego, besides those, we come up with ourselves. We have lots of thoughts about ourselves, and we go to travel and to find ourselves. And once we've done that, we're looking possibly for the I, and we come up with ideas what the I is possible. We may come to the conclusion that, oh, the I is something separate from mind and body. We may have that wrong view. As a result of the sense there is an inherent I, a view that is innate, and based on that wrong innate view, we develop an intellectual kind of view that though it's not innate, we were not born with it, it's still a wrong view. But if the usual innate sense of clinging or grasping an inherent I, if the basis for that were the separate I, if it was in all cases that separate inherent I, then even beings who never intellectually thought about some separate inherent I would have that as a focal object, and that doesn't happen. That doesn't happen. So here, with regard to this last line, there's no separate, now I have to look for it. I don't find it that quickly. Yet one that sees, where is it again? Oh yeah, for the identity, 124, yeah. For the identity, so because the identity view is present even in those unaware of such a self. So like a little child who's never thought of like a separate inherent I, even them, if that had to be that separate inherent I were the basis for innate self-grasping, well then even these little children would have would have a sense of, or would focus on a totally separate I and perceive that to be inherently existent. And therefore, there would be an apprehension of such a separate I, but there isn't yet. They haven't developed that view, which is why it can only be the conventional I, because the conventional I, although we are not aware of the conventional I and that it is the conventional I, but when we just have the thought I without any self-grasping, then that is the conventional I. We do apprehend it, but we're not aware. We can't separate it from the inherent I because it appears to exist inherently. But despite its appearance, we can separate that appearance from just the conventional I that is the object. Okay, just that we perceive a cupboard, we perceive an existent cupboard. It appears to exist inherently, but separating that from the appearance, we can still perceive a cupboard. Just as we can still perceive an I, but we're just not aware that this is the actual I versus the inherently existent I, because we're not able to separate them. Okay, so I hope I haven't confused you too much with the last bit that I said. Do you have time with the discussion group to go through it? I did say we're a little bit over time, but we always are, so I guess you're used to it. So I did say, do you have any idea why, in terms of grasping at the I or attachment to the I, that seems to be stronger than, or is it stronger? First of all, let's ask, is it stronger, our attachment to the I, is that stronger than attachment to mine? And is that true for any type of mine? Are we more attached to that which is mine versus to that something else which is mine? And do you think the attachment to I is stronger than the attachment to mine? Anyone on that? Would anyone like to say something about that? Go ahead, just raise your hand, maybe your virtual hand, and then unmute yourself. I don't do this often. Oh yes, Snehi. Am I pronouncing that right?
Almost. It's Sneh.
Sneh. Okay, Sneh. All right. Sneh, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
I was just thinking it's just so much more natural because of our language and how we, everybody just says I. So you just feel like, I is a given. I have an identity. And there's not much thought. Like until I studied Buddhist philosophy, I really didn't think what that I meant. Like, I never even heard the word aggregates or any kind of analysis to even think about like who what is my real nature or who am I, till I started, because I'm Indian, I started with Indian philosophy.
Okay.
And that's their first question is, who am I? Like, what is your real nature? But before that, it never came up. I was just, this is who, I, and this is mine, and just like that.
But is there a sense like mine, for instance, my body? Is there attachment to my body?
Yes.
Is there more attachment to I or more attachment to my body? Do you think there's a difference between the two?
Until you asked me, I never really thought about it.
Okay.
I think somehow I is stronger because I feel I can give away what is mine. Like, even if I really cherish something, it's mine, I can still give it away. Whereas I feel like it's hard to give away.
I.
Yeah, that.
Okay, great. All right. So there's a sense the attachment to the I is stronger because that's still closer than mine to the sense of I. Okay, great. All right. Thank you. Anyone else? Besides Sneh, that was helpful. Anyone else? Gallery, so I see everyone. Didn't see it. Yes, Edward. Am I saying it right, Edward?
Yes, that's correct. Thank you. How do we relate to my mind?
Are you asking me a question or are you?
I'm asking, actually, that's a very Israeli
that's fine.
Story. Okay. How do we relate to my mind in the sense that I versus my mind in, what we were talking about in a more conventional way. So I and my mind, some years ago, there was someone who was indicted in the States for some horrible crime. And part of his defense was to say, my brain made me do it.
My brain made me do it.
My brain made me do it.
That I can relate to that. I sometimes blame my brain. I blame my mind. I do it all the time. Interesting. Okay, so we talked about with Sneh, I mentioned more the body, and there's a sense, oh yeah, my body of course is important. I'm more attached to my body than to my books or whatever. But if you take the body and you take the mind, well, how about the mind? That's even closer. And then also seeing a sense that it's not me, but it's the brain, right? That's interesting. It's in this case, it's almost a separation between I and brain. It's not me, it's my brain. It's almost like perceiving and somehow having that moment of, well, it's a separate I there, right? Like totally separate. That's probably more intellectually acquired. It can only be this brain doing its thing. Okay, well, it's an interesting new thought. What we're still left with is the attachment to I stronger or the attachment to the mind stronger, right? And anyway, we need to leave it at this so we can still keep that going as part of the, thank you, Eduardo, for that. That's definitely interesting that there's this aspect as well with the person blaming their own brain or maybe their own mind and seeing them as separate. Although that's not an innate sense, intellectually acquired, it could still develop. But besides that, of course, you have your homework on the method side, but don't forget about the wisdom side. And every now and then, if you do have the space of mind and the interest and so forth, to check, am I more attached to the I? Or am I more attached to my body? More attached to my mind? Where is it and why could that be that one or the other I'm more attached to, right? Just become a little bit more aware, because self-centeredness actually includes all of those, attachment to I and also mine, in particular my happiness. Okay, great. But we need to leave it at that in order to have some time left for meditation. Yeah, and there's nothing more to say before meditation. We'll start as usual with some breathing. So just to let go of any disruptive thoughts and calm the mind. So let's start with a bit of self-reflection. That you should try to identify or become aware of your personal sense of an I that is unchanging. That is, are there times when you feel the I this morning is the same as the I right now? Or the I that signed into Zoom at the beginning of this session is the same as the I that's meditating. Do you have the thought, I'm always the same. I don't change. Or is there a sense that your I, at times, not at all times, but at times, is there a sense that the I is totally separate from your mind and body? Maybe during days when you feel like, I'm just not myself today. A sense that your mind and body are acting totally separate from yourself, leading to the thought, I'm just not myself today. Or maybe Eduardo's example, that the brain is just doing its thing. It's got nothing to do with my I. Or my mind is just doing its thing. It's just going crazy. And the I is just watching it from afar. all these apprehension of the self are coarser, wrong views about the I that arise as a result of our deepest and subtle grasping at an inherently existent I. Yeah, at the time when this perception of the I arises, the mind is not aware that this is a wrong view. Instead, it leads to actions that are induced by that misapprehension. So let's analyze whether such separate and permanent I can really exist. If the I was unchanging, while body and mind change all the time, how could I transform as a result of Buddhist practice? Or I become a good gymnast or sports person, if my I hasn't changed, only my body has. And if the I exists as totally separate from mind and body, how could I be hurt when someone hurts my feeling? And how could I be beaten up by someone if they hit my body? And can I really talk of the I totally separate from mind and body? What kind of I would that be? muscular talk of a table totally separate from its parts. And so therefore, it's impossible for the I to exist separate from mind and body and as an unchanging entity. Making it permanent, heartless and independent self impossible. So now in conclusion, whatever insight you've reached, whatever feeling has arisen as a result of this analysis, use one-pointed meditation to single-pointedly focus on that feeling and allow for it to sink deeper into your mind. All right. Okay, so that's enough for today. I've done a little bit of meditation on wisdom, selflessness here. And again, don't let go of it in that you don't just wait until we talk about it again next week, but try and come back to it as often as you can throughout this week. But of course, also in terms of our practice of the method aspect, just to remind you, what does it mean, all sentient beings? Can you really widen your perception of that? And if not, what are the problems? What are the individual difficulties with the different groups of people? And see whether you can work through it. And then finally, of course, important to dedicate whatever positive potential we've accumulated here together as a group. Let's dedicate this. Well, I've been asked, first of all, to dedicate it towards the good rebirth of Dalit's grandmother. Her name is Rebecca Kahanov. She just passed away. She was 106 years old. So to dedicate the virtue that we've accumulated towards positive rebirth, may wherever she is right now experience peace of mind, happiness, well-being, and of course take on a good rebirth. And evolve her mind, transform her mind in a way so that she'll be able to find lasting happiness. And that's dedicated, of course, also for those who are sick, like Tali Lubin and so many other people suffering from debilitating diseases, well, physical as well as mental. So let's dedicate towards all those beings suffering right now. May our virtue contribute to the well-being of these beings. May it help them to reduce their suffering, their pain, and so forth. But of course, may it also become the cause for us to become fully enlightened. So very important, may this become a cause for enlightenment of a Buddha, so that one day will be of greatest benefit to all sentient beings. And of course, extremely important, may the positive potential we've accumulated be a cause for our great spiritual masters, like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, like Jadu Rinpoche, and all other wonderful lamas, to have an extremely long life and to continue to turn the wheel of Dharma. Okay. So, with this thought in the back of our mind, we recite Shantideva's prayer. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then, may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. Oh, great. All right, so that's it. It's clear what to do for this coming week, and all that's left is to wish you a good week. Be well, and see you again in a few days. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Geshe.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Night.